Well, take your Bibles and open up with me to Daniel chapter 2. The second chapter of Daniel is where we'll be this morning. And I'm going to let you know in advance, there's portions of this that are going to get just a little technical. So if you're used to kind of like a feel-good message and you didn't have to put your thinking cap on, you're probably just going to have to put your thinking cap on with me this morning as we think through some of this. But I also want to start by telling you, just because it's sometimes a little technical when you try to interpret a particular vision in the Bible, that doesn't mean that it isn't practical. There are places in this story that are going to be incredibly practical. And I'll start off with just kind of a confession. When I got into Daniel chapter 2 and I see this vision and it's all about these various kingdoms, I'll summarize it real quickly. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, a vision. The vision is of this statue. The statue has a gold head, silver upper body, bronze lower body, legs of iron, and then feet of iron and clay. Okay, so that's kind of the image. And then this stone comes out of nowhere and crushes the image, and Nebuchadnezzar doesn't know what to do with it. And as Daniel begins to unpack it, he tells you that these are various kingdoms. So I started my preparation for this Sunday thinking, oh, it's all about big kingdoms. It's all about big nations. It's all about big things. And the more I began to read, I began to think differently about it. That this is really a story, even though it is about those kingdoms, this is a story between Nebuchadnezzar, God, and Daniel. It's really just as much about God and the individual. And that helps me, right? Because we live in a world that's filled with pandemics, terrorists, national catastrophes, political scandals, things that are big, nations that are against each other. And it's easy to pick up the news and say, I wonder who our enemy is today, and I wonder who somebody else's enemy is today. And it's easy in that to start to feel like you're not really that important. You're just one little piece, right? So here is this great chapter about what looks like big things, like kingdoms that are overturned and overruled and overthrown, and huge, very, very popular kings. And then all of a sudden, that just becomes the backdrop for a God who is interested in the individual. So we're going to take a look at that, and we'll pick up the reading in Daniel chapter 2. You may remember last week we covered the first part of this chapter. So I'll just start reading in verse 25. Then Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste and said to him, this is the pagan king, Nebuchadnezzar, I have found among the exiles from Judah a man who will make known to the king the interpretation. And the king declared to Daniel, whose name was Belshazzar, remember that's the pagan name that the king named Daniel, are you able to make known to me the dream that I have seen and its interpretation? You may remember that Nebuchadnezzar had asked a very difficult thing. He said, I just don't want to know the interpretation. I'm not telling you the dream. You got to tell me what I dreamed and then tell me the interpretation. And Daniel answered and said to the king, no wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery that the king has asked. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Let me just give you three ideas here that are focusing on the God portion, and then at the end we'll wrap up with the individual portion. When you look at God in this chapter, you're going to look at his wisdom, his sovereignty, his plan, okay? God's wisdom, God's sovereignty, God's plan. And here's the first idea, found right in chapter 2, verse 20. In his wisdom, God knows what the future holds. In his wisdom, God knows what the future holds. Now, perhaps you've heard me share this before, but God knows actualities, possibilities, as if they're actualities. So when you and I say things like, well, what if this had happened? Or what if I had done that? Or what if I only had talked to that person? Or what if only if. God knows all of those things and has played them all out, and he understands what is best for you, and he has brought about what is best for you. And so that's just a really cool way to understand that God's wisdom is so far superior to ours. Now you find that actually here in the text. Just look with me at it. There we read in verse 27, Daniel answered the king and said, no wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery that the king has asked. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. Now, this isn't a mystery like an Agatha Christie mystery where it's like a whodunit, where we don't know until the very end. This is something that God fully knows but that slowly he parcels out or reveals to us. There is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Now, this is great. What Daniel is saying is, listen, he is telling you something that's going to happen later. He's revealed to you something in this vision that is going to happen later, right? Now, man, any one of us would love that, right? We'd like to know what's going to happen later. And notice this also in verse 30, we capture the same idea. But as for me, this mystery has been revealed to me. Now, this is great because Daniel doesn't take credit for it. And we're going to come back to that at the end. But just look at this. This mystery has been revealed to me, not because of any wisdom that I have more than all the living, but in order that the interpretation may be known to the king and that you may know the thoughts of your mind. In other words, this was your vision. I'm about to tell you what it was. I'm about to interpret it for you, and I don't get the credit for it. I love that. It's also a great reminder for how you and I should respond when God has given us a task to do and we've done it. We're probably far too quick to kind of at least touch a bit of the credit for it. Not so with Daniel. In fact, at the end of this chapter, Nebuchadnezzar is going to say, listen, I'm going to make you in charge of almost everything, and I'm going to give you a new robe, and you're going to get this, and you're going to get this, and by the way, what would you like? And he'd say, I like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to be able to serve, and Nebuchadnezzar says, sure. It's like anything he requests, but Daniel doesn't seem to touch the credit for what he's about to do. Just picture this. He's going to do something that no other wise men in all of Babylon can do. He's going to tell them the dream, and then he's going to give the interpretation. This is just a great reminder. In God's wisdom, he knows what the future holds. We don't. Which, by the way, when you and I get in a mindset where we start to say, why did God do that? Or why did God let that happen? Or why? We have to acknowledge we don't have all the data. If we had all the data that God has, we would have made the same decision. This mystery has been revealed to me, he says. Okay, here's the second idea. In his sovereignty, God moves leaders and nations for his purposes. In his sovereignty, God moves leaders and nations for his purposes. Now, we're going to read through this passage and kind of unpack the vision and then the interpretation, and that's where it may get a little technical, but just kind of stay with me. I don't want you to miss this overarching idea. Don't get lost in the details. Just know this, that God is a sovereign God, and he moves leaders and nations for his purposes. Let me give you an example of that before we actually unpack it. In Galatians chapter 4, we read, but when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law. Meaning, when God saw a certain timetable occur, he said, okay, now is the time for Jesus to come to earth. Now, you may remember that Jesus was born in what city? Bethlehem, that's right, not a trick question, okay? He was born in Bethlehem, and he was born in Bethlehem, which was prophesied hundreds of years earlier in the book of Micah, Micah chapter 5, verse 2, and we know that because when the wise men come to see Jesus, the religious leaders say, oh, we know where the king's going to be born. He's going to be born in Bethlehem because Micah said that hundreds of years ago, and so the wise men actually operate by faith, and they go out there and they see Jesus, right? And so here's your picture. Just think of all the details that got to happen. Right. God has to work in a Roman emperor's heart to say, it's time to tax the people again. Okay. Well, you say he was a governor, so that makes sense. Doesn't have to work very hard there, okay? But the picture is this, that God still worked the timing of that some 600 miles away so that he could send a message all the way over to Israel so that in Israel, they could get this message out that we're going to take a census of the people. And that message goes up to Nazareth and Joseph and Mary. Can you imagine this conversation? Mary, we got to walk about 60 miles. Don't you know I'm about to have a baby? Right. Yeah, I know you're about to have a baby, but it's what the Roman emperor said. I don't even know where we're going to stay, but we got to go, okay? How does God work out all of that timing and get Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem, where the baby's born, and they land in Bethlehem, and the baby's born in Bethlehem? Just think about that for a moment. A deist would tell you that God basically kind of cranked the world up. He set the clock, put it in motion, and then he stepped away. That's not the God of the Scriptures. The God of the Scriptures is sovereignly involved and intricately involved in all of these details. He determines when Jesus is born. He determines when the taxes are due. He determines all of that stuff. This is the God of the Bible. He's intricately involved. And that's why we say it's just not God knowing the future. It's God having his hands in the details of the future. In his sovereignty, God moves leaders and nations for his purposes. Now, with that in mind, let's kind of walk through this story. So here comes Daniel, and he says, okay, I'm going to tell you the dream, okay? See if this is what you dreamed. You saw, O king, and behold, a great image. This image, mighty and of exceeding brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, and its middle and thighs of bronze, and its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. And as you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. And then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold all together were broken in pieces and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floor. And the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the dream. Now we will tell the king its interpretation. Okay. I love that. Can you imagine? I mean, Nebuchadnezzar is probably saying, okay, the guy's going to bluff me. And then he gives him verbatim the dream and the detail. Like he remembers certain things in the dream. And you can almost picture Nebuchadnezzar saying, okay, now I want to know the interpretation. Now, what I want you to remember is this idea, right? In his sovereignty, God moves leaders and nations for his purposes. Now, Nebuchadnezzar didn't really believe in the God of Israel. He didn't believe in Daniel's God. And he didn't believe that that God was sovereign. He believed that he was sovereign. Nebuchadnezzar thought he was sovereign over all things. But notice what Daniel adds. You, O king, the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom. God was intricately involved. He gave you the kingdom, the power and the might and the glory, and into whose hand he has given wherever they dwell, the children of men and the beasts of the field and the birds of the heavens. Listen, Nebuchadnezzar, God has given you all of those things. It's just so important because remember, in a few chapters, when Nebuchadnezzar is overwhelmed by his prideful spirit and says, listen, it's all about me, God makes him respond like the beast of the field on all fours. It's this really remarkable reminder that God was the one who had given him charge over everything, but because he thought he was in charge of everything by his own making, God made him like the very things he was in charge of. And then I love this, making you rule over them all. You are the head of gold. Okay, so this is just this image again. In his sovereignty, God moves leaders and nations for his purposes. Okay, now, I love it when the Bible does this. It can get a little confusing, but it sometimes uses pictures or images. That's a great way to learn and a great way to remember. So this statue would have looked something like this, okay? It would have looked something like this. It had a head of gold. It had an upper body of silver. It had a mid-torso of bronze. Its legs were of iron, and then there was iron and clay formed in its feet, okay? This is the statue. In fact, I don't know how I never noticed this before. If I were to say to you, gold, silver, and bronze, what's the first thing that comes to mind? The Olympics, okay? Where do you think they got that from, okay? I mean, we just assume it happened, right? It just struck me all of a sudden, like in study. I thought, gold, silver, and bronze. Okay, but that's beside the point. Here's what one writer says. He said, the progression of world history is typically not upward to glory and unity, but rather downward to dishonor and disunity. Now, this is so contrary to the world view in which we live. Everybody thinks it's going to get better, 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 better. That's not the biblical understanding. It's really not history either. Thus, the statue progresses from gold to silver to bronze to iron, and from one head to a chest and arms to a belly to thighs to feet and toes of composite iron and clay. There's it's almost like a degradation of this gold, silver, bronze. Now, Daniel's going to give the interpretation, and here it is. This was the dream. Now we will tell the king its interpretation. So he's fully got his attention. You, O king, the king of kings. Okay. Now that almost sounds like the name for Jesus, but a little later, Nebuchadnezzar is going to say, this God of yours is the Lord of kings, okay? He's over me. I may be over other kings, but he's over me. And then Daniel answers this, you are the head of gold. So we immediately understand in the vision, we know without even guessing who the head of gold is. It's Babylon, right? And so we've got some dates there, 606 to 539 BC. That's not necessarily important, but it's important for this reason, that if Babylon is the first one mentioned, then everything else, if Daniel's writing in Babylon, everything else has to be future, at least from Daniel's perspective. So Daniel and King Nebuchadnezzar are getting these ideas. Now, some writers have said, well, no, that's not really what happened. What happened is somewhere around 400, between 400 and the birth of Christ, in that period, somebody wrote and claimed to be Daniel, okay? I think that's bogus, but here's the point. They make that argument because they're trying to make it look like prophecy, right? This is prophecy. God knew what the future held. God knew what the future held. God sovereignly ordained the future. And so God can say, this is what it's going to be, and that's what it's going to be. Okay? So here's the rest of the verse. Another kingdom inferior to you shall arise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. So the kingdom that comes next, after Babylon falls, is going to be this king in verse 39. And there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, because iron breaks to pieces and shatters all things. And like iron that crushes, it shall break and crush all these. So now we know the next three categories. The silver represents the Medo-Persian Empire. The bronze represents the Grecian emperor. And iron represents Rome, because these are the kingdoms that follow, okay? Now, just for a moment, consider these dates. God is prophesying from 606 BC all the way out to 476 AD. That's like 1,000 years. God said, okay, this is what's going to happen in the next 1,000 years. I just want you to just kind of rest in that for a second. When you and I are concerned that the world is going to blow up, right? Or something bad is going to happen because some nation got ahead of us in creating nuclear armaments or something. When we're so concerned with that, do we not remember that God sets out 1,000 years? He sets out the entire time, and he makes it happen accordingly. It's a beautiful reminder. God knows what's coming, and he sovereignly ordains it, and he's working through it. Now, there's one final category, and that's the feet. And so we read here, and as you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it shall be a divided kingdom, but some of the firmness of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw iron mixed with soft clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly iron and partly clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly brittle, okay? You say, wow, Phil, I told you it's going to get a little technical, okay? Let me make it easy for you. How many toes does everybody have? 10, typically, okay? We should have 10 toes, all right? So here's the picture. This human statue has 10 toes. And they are partially clay and partially iron. He goes on to talk about those particular toes. As you saw the iron mix with soft clay, so they will mix with one another in marriage. You say, what is that talking about? Just stay with me. But they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of those kings, just saw something, plural. Those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. So all of a sudden, you realize that there seem to be this element coming where there seems to be some kind of coalition. Coalition because they were intermarrying as nations would intermarry at the time. And not only that, but this was the days of the kings, plural. There's some kind of coalition. So we're going to call this a future coalition of nations, right? A future coalition of nations. Now, watch in the picture. It's partially iron, which means it has to do something probably with iron, which is Rome, that kingdom, but not fully that kingdom. It probably is a loosely connected element of various kingdoms or nations. In fact, I love the way that one writer has captured it. He says, shortly before the second coming of Christ, 10 kingdoms or nations, or that could be interpreted metaphorically, so it could just be a unit of people, unit of nations, of unequal strength, unite to form a coalition that will rise out of the ruins of the ancient Roman Empire. Since Rome is part of Europe and the activities of that ancient empire centered in Europe, it is reasonable to assume that this area of the world will play a leading role in the future regime. And so it's just reasonable to consider that when this coalition of nations comes together, which hasn't happened yet, okay, when it comes together, It's going to be centered over there someplace in Europe. And again, even in my lifetime, we've watched suddenly various countries and nations just change names or redivide. For years, we had purchased some chairs and we lived in California. And if you flip those chairs over, the bottom of the chair said, "Made in Yugoslavia." Okay. Now, I never asked my kids to do this, but I should have said, "Go find Yugoslavia." They wouldn't have been able to find it on the globe, right? Because Yugoslavia now is divided up among Bosnia, Serbia, and Croatia. In other words, these nations are constantly shifting and moving. And what you want to understand is that at some stage in the future time that thing's going to align where you have a coalition of nations that is barely held together. That's why it's iron and clay. It's just barely held together. His sovereignty, God moves. God moves leaders and nations for his purposes. Here's the final thing. In his plan, God will set up a kingdom that will endure forever. In his plan, God will set up a kingdom that will endure forever. So here's what you see in verse 44. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. Nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. Yet as you saw that a stone was cut from the mountain by no human hand, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, the gold, a great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain, the interpretation is sure. It's almost like Daniel says, okay, there it is. I got your dream right. I got your interpretation right. You think you're in charge, but you can't change it. I love that. It sounds a little bit like how Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dream. He says, those dreams happened twice because God is certain. He's made up his mind and he's not changing it. Okay. In fact, here's what happens in the rest of that image. This stone that is carved from the mountains, not made with hands, he says in verse 34, as you look, this is the dream again, a stone was cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold all together were broken in pieces. So your image, Nebuchadnezzar, of which you were the golden head, okay, your kingdom is going to be destroyed, and the kingdom after it's going to be destroyed, and the kingdom after it's going to be destroyed, and the kingdom after it's going to be destroyed. And then when they try to actually pull together a coalition at some stage, all of that's going to be destroyed too. Okay, now, that's not the technical part. Sorry, okay? In the middle of this discussion, you have to ask a question about what comprises a kingdom, okay? And this is just an important distinction because I know some of you grew up in different churches, and so I just want to clarify how we come to the understanding so that you could say, okay, I at least understand how you came to the understanding. So I got to talk to you briefly about something known as an amillennialist and a premillennialist, okay? Now, millennial basically means this. You say, well, I know what a millennial is. They're sitting next to me, okay? Not that kind of millennial, okay? A millennium is a 1,000-year period of time. Okay? So don't think of it in the contemporary. Think of it as 1,000 years. A millennium is 1,000 years. Some of you are old enough to remember when we came into the year 2000. How many of you can remember that? Okay. How many of you sat up, waited, and thought the power was going to go out? Can I see your hands? Okay, yeah, I was there, okay? And if I could have done it over again, we were celebrating New Year's with someone at somebody's house. I can still remember where we were. I would have found their breaker box and just gone and dropped it, okay? And come back in the room and said, what happened? What happened? The whole world has stopped, But nothing happened, but here's the point. We recognize that a millennium is 1,000 years. The Bible in Revelation 19 and 20, Revelation 20, but 19 sets it up, talks about 1,000-year reign of Christ, where Satan is bound and he can't come up, and where Christ reigns for 1,000 years. Now, an amillennialist would say, that's that negative prefix. When I say agnostic, that's someone who puts a negative on knowledge and says, I don't know for certain that I wouldn't know for certain that there can be a God or not be a God. An atheist would put a negative on theism and say, I believe there's not a God, okay? When you put an A on the front of a word, it makes it a negative, okay? So an amillennialist would say, I don't believe in the 1,000-year period. I don't believe that's a literal 1,000 years. I believe it's speaking of an idea, not 1,000 years, okay? Now, that's important. You'll see in a second. Because however this stone breaks down the kingdoms, you're going to understand when the stone was thrown, came down from the mountain and broke down the kingdoms. A premillennialist, put pre on the beginning of something, says that Christ will return prior to the millennium, and he'll set that up. Okay, now, you have your finger in Daniel, but go with me to Revelation real quickly. Okay, Revelation chapter 20. And I'll show you that, but I also want to show you just how Christ comes, because it's very different than how he came in the first advent. And the question we have to ask ourselves is based upon this image right here, crash, bang, whole kingdoms fall, okay? Which most likely represents how Christ came. Chapter 20, verse 1, then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon and the ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound them for 1,000 years and threw them into a pit. And then there's thrones set up, and Christ begins to reign. But look at how that's set up in verse 11 of chapter 19. John writes there, and he says, then I saw heaven open, and behold, a white horse. The one sitting on it is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness and judges, he judges and makes war. His eyes are like a flame of fire, and on his head are many diadems, and he has a name written that no one knows but himself. He is clothed in a robe dipped in blood, and the name by which he is called is the Word of God, okay? Clearly an image of Jesus. I remember when we were in Haiti, and we went into one of the Catholic churches there. They had various images of Christ around. And I just remember where we were in the church, there was an image of like a statue that was made of a white horse. And obviously, if you knew your Bible, you knew who was on the white horse, okay? And it wasn't Christopher Columbus, okay? It was Jesus, okay? And so that was the image that was there. So let me just unpack why this is important to this discussion. So here's your theological distinctions. An amillennialist holds that the kingdom was established by Christ at the first advent, not the second coming, but at the first advent when he came as a baby. And then he grew up, and then he died on the cross, and then he was put in a tomb, and then he was resurrected. And they would say, okay, that is his kingdom established. A premillennialist would say it's true that he established some kind of kingdom there. But remember what Jesus says to Pilate. He says, my kingdom's not of this world. If it would have been, my disciples would have gotten up and brought swords and they'd have taken you guys out. My kingdom's not of this world. In other words, in Revelation 19, he returns to this world to put in place his kingdom. The premillennialist holds that the kingdom will be established by Christ at his second coming, which means Christ returns, and we look forward to that, and he sets up his kingdom for 1,000 years. And I would make the case that this kingdom that will never be destroyed is taking place in the premillennial side far more clearly than it's taking place from the perspective of an amillennialist. Note that the kingdom was established by Christ at the first advent, but I don't see this image when Christ comes at the first advent. I see a baby coming in a manger, humble, walking in humility, learning from his parents, for he learned obedience through the things he suffered, Hebrews says. He's growing, he's changing, he's discovering. It doesn't seem like the king coming on the white horse, crashing kingdoms. And that's why we would say that these 10 toes, these future coalition, it's coming together at some stage, but Christ will return. You say, well, what about the rapture? Okay, that is not a discussion for today. That's a discussion for a whole nother day, okay? But for now, I just want you to draw this distinction. First coming, he comes as a baby. Second coming, he comes as the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, eyes of fire. You and I should find hope in that if you're a believer in him, that there is a day where we reign with him, and that's the King of Kings. And if you aren't in a relationship with God through Christ, you ought to say, wait a minute, at some stage, he's just not a baby in a manger to me. He's the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And that's why the text says, and in those days, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. That day's coming. It's just not here yet. In his plan, God will set up a kingdom that will endure forever. That gives the Christian an incredible hope. It causes us to look at the nations and say, hey, listen, these nations, these groups of people, these huge people groups, these nations that are armed, that have weapons, they can't hold a candle to the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. It's not about us being more powerful than them. It's about Christ being more powerful than all of us. In his plan, God will set up a kingdom that will endure forever. Now, I just got to wrap up with these thoughts, okay? God and the individual. Because there's two individuals in this story, not just God with the backdrop of the nations saying, this is who I am in my wisdom, in my sovereignty, and in my plan. It's God also saying, this is who these individuals are. So ponder this. Nebuchadnezzar gets this vision. Daniel interprets him. And it sounds like Nebuchadnezzar becomes a believer if everything stopped at Daniel chapter 2, verse 46, but it doesn't, okay? Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and paid homage to Daniel and commanded that an offering and incense be offered up to him. And the king answered and said to Daniel, truly, your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords and the revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery. But notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't say he is my God. He says he's your God. You see, here's the idea. Each of us is prone to pride and can fail to give God the glory, period. Each of us is prone to pride and can fail to give God the glory. Nebuchadnezzar refuses to give God the glory until God humbles him in Daniel chapter 4. Each of us is prone to pride and can fail to give God the glory. In verse 47, he says he's your God. But in chapter 3, verse 1, it starts out, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, and it's 90 feet tall. He makes the very image that he saw in his dream that was destroyed in his dream. In fact, I love the way one writer captured it. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream about the temporary nature of his kingdom, that it's going to be smashed, okay? And the first thing he does is he goes out and makes an idol to himself. Okay? Now, just think about that for a second. You had a dream. It was given to you by God. God said, listen, your kingdom is temporary. It's not even going to last but another 60 years. Your kingdom is very, very temporary. And then all the kingdoms after that are temporary too, because only God, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, will set up a kingdom that will endure forever. Your kingdom is temporary. And Nebuchadnezzar says, okay, where's the mold? Let's make a statue. Okay. The very thing that God showed him that his kingdom was temporary, he attempts to make it permanent. Why? Because we tend to struggle with pride. All of us do. I was thinking of this in light of kind of where we are. So we live in a free country, sort of, kind of, still a little bit, okay? We live in a free, some of you will figure that out this afternoon, okay? We live in a free country, and that freedom to us, the best part of that freedom is that we can help others in need. Now just pause and think about this for a second. Nebuchadnezzar is totally autonomous. He's under God, but everybody else, every other human being, he's over, okay, at his time frame. And yet he doesn't spend any of that freedom on others. He just spends it on himself. And I was thinking how that is kind of like us. In fact, a way to say it is this way. The best part about personal freedom is that we can help others in need. That's what we've kind of been doing in the community as a church for the last couple weeks. We've been able to be out there helping others in need. We could adjust our schedule. We had personal freedom. We didn't even have to ask anybody. We just went out and started working, right? The worst part about our personal freedom is that we quickly grow accustomed to helping only ourselves. That's right. For just a moment, if you're arguing for your freedom, okay, can I ask you a question? Why? Who are you using it for? Are you using it to help others? Are you just saying, you know, I think my rights are violated and I want my rights back. I want my freedom back. Or are you saying, hey, the reason I want freedom back is so that I can help people. I want to do and help others. But I just want to remind you, when pride kind of sweeps in, what happens is we end up thinking it's about us. Just like Nebuchadnezzar, we build our own idols. We build idols to ourselves. Now, that's the prideful individual. Here's the humble individual. Each of us can walk in humility and encourage others to worship God. Each of us can walk in humility and encourage others to worship God. I shared this verse with you earlier, but here it is again in verse 30. Daniel said, but as for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because of any wisdom that I have more than all the living? But in order that the interpretation may be made known to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your mind. God, who reveals mysteries, revealed the mystery to me. God gets all the credit. That's what Daniel says. Daniel says, listen, it's all about God getting the credit. It's not about me. And that's why, in verse 47, at least temporarily, the king seemed to worship Daniel's God. Truly, your God is the God of God and Lord of kings and the revealer of mysteries, for he's revealed to you this mystery. He did this because Daniel didn't take any of the credit for himself in his humility. In fact, I love the way that John Walvoord captured it. He said, Daniel's answer is a masterpiece of setting the matter in its proper light and giving God the glory. He says, listen, I know the answer to your dream. I even know the interpretation, but I can't take credit for it. That is like the ultimate. That's like the guy who got it exactly right, the athlete who got everything perfect. And then when somebody tried to give him the credit for it, he said, no, not mine, can't take it. Daniel's answer is the masterpiece of setting the matter in its proper light. Here's what happened, but God gets the glory. That's how you and I want to learn to think. Well, we always like to close our discussion with a couple of takeaways. So here it is. So we've kind of meandered through some kind of technical stuff. That's what happens when you see these visions. You want to try to think through them and understand them in light of a historical context, in light of what the words are saying. So hopefully we've been able to do that. But we always want to come back and say, okay, what should I learn from it? And here it is, briefly. God can be trusted with the future. Just say that with me. God can be trusted with the future. That's exactly right. I don't know what your future holds in the next 24 hours. I don't know what it holds in the next week, but God can be trusted with it. Okay? He has the wisdom, he has the sovereignty, and he has the plan. Right? So God can be trusted with it. So here's our question. Will you respond in pride or in humility? Will you say, well, I don't like God's plan, so I'm just going to do it my way, right? I guess you can do that, but that's revealing in your pride that you know more than God knows. Or can you in your humility learn to say, not my will, but yours be done. Not my will, but yours be done. Those are today's takeaways. God can be trusted with the future. Will you respond in pride or in humility? Father, it's been a privilege to look to your word this morning. We are grateful. We are thankful that it's true, that it's sure, that it's certain. Even Peter says so in his writing. He says, and so we have the prophetic word made more sure, to which we would do well to apply as a light shining in the darkness. Help us in the world in which we live to say, I just believe what the Bible says about the future. And while I may not understand it fully or all of it, and some of it you're still revealing to us interpretively over time, Lord, we're just grateful that you gave us something that is sure and something that is certain. For those who are with us today who are struggling, Lord, with the reality of how short life is, how quickly it passes, for those who are struggling with discouragement or despair or wishing that they could do more in the time they have left, I pray that you would use this time in their lives to remind them that they can trust you. They can trust a God who not only knows the future, but is intimately involved in arranging the details for each of us. Help us love you well, and we thank you today, most of all for Jesus, who so graciously and sacrificially gave his life so that we can have the promise of life after this life. We need not grieve, though we grieve, without hope. We can grieve knowing that we will see our loved ones again and that we will see Jesus face to face one day, in whose name we pray. Amen.